Last week, we wrapped up our series on messages of the cross and tomb, and we finished with a message about the fact that we are called to be disciples of Christ, that God has a place for us, a plan for us, and a purpose for us as His children. And so today we're going to look at what Jesus says it takes, at least as far as kind of an overall summary of what it takes to be His disciple. And I say it as a summary because it's not going to go into some of the details of some of the steps and things that He lays out later on that we are specifically to go through, but rather it is giving us sort of the principle that guides the overall process. And so we begin this morning with Luke chapter 9, and beginning with verse 23, as we find Jesus talking to those that He had called to be His disciples, talking to those that were gathering around Him in the crowds, and kind of preparing them for what the future held. So Luke chapter 9, beginning with verse 23. He said to them all, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man, will be ashamed of them when He comes in His glory and in the glory of the Father and of the holy angels." Now, Jesus begins with what I'm going to call the obvious. But He doesn't list it as step one. But the first thing He says is, you got to want to be a disciple. Now, He doesn't list this as step one because He is talking to a group of people who are already displaying the fact that, hey, we think we want to be a disciple. We want to be a follower of Christ. And so Jesus is starting with the understanding that there's already a level of belief, already a level of faith that's there. But it bears saying, to be a disciple of Christ, you've got to want to be a disciple of Christ. And it brings us to this realization that there are levels of faith, there are levels of want, desire, that we recognize within our lives. I've had a lot of things through the years that I wanted. I didn't want them bad enough to do what it was going to take to get them. There's two different levels of want there, isn't there? The things that I really wanted, I did what it took to get those things. I may have sacrificed some things to get it. I may have worked some extra time to get it. I may have figured out something I didn't need that somebody else wanted bad enough to trade me for it. All sorts of different ways, but the level of my desire determined whether or not I accomplished that. Jesus says, okay, so you want to be my disciples. You say that you want this. You're showing a level of desire about this. But what he doesn't say is, because you want to be my disciple, you already are. Let me restate that. You say that one more time so it comes across clear. He did not say, because you want to be my disciple, you are one. There is a difference in the level of want. Now, why is this important? It's important because in order to want to be a disciple and become a disciple of Christ, there has to be a level of faith and a level of belief in who he is and what he has done, that it moves you to do what is necessary to become a disciple. There are those who take the words of Paul in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, and a lot of passages from the book of Romans where Paul deals a lot on the subject of faith. And they take Paul's statements and they try to say something that Paul's not saying. Let's look at the verse first. Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2, beginning with verse 8. For it is by grace that you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. They take that passage and they teach, see, as soon as you believe, and as soon as you have faith, you're saved. That anything else is a work. Well, there's a partially rightness to that statement. We are definitely saved by grace, through faith. What Paul says. But that faith must be understood from a biblical viewpoint. And when you look at the totality of scriptures, belief never stood on its own. Paul is writing that passage to a group of people who have already become disciples of Christ, who have already become Christians. They've already been told what steps they needed to take, and they had taken those steps. As Paul is writing that, he is dealing with an issue where others are coming in and saying, okay, it's great that you've done this, but you've got to continue, or in the case of the Gentiles, you have got to start keeping the 10 Commandments. You have got to keep the circumcision of Abraham. You have got to keep the law of Moses. And if you don't, you can't be saved. Paul is dealing with the fact that if you take that viewpoint, you have nullified the cross of Christ. You have taken it from being about faith in what Jesus has done, and you have elevated the law, you have elevated the circumcision of Abraham, you have elevated those things and said, these are what saves you. They weren't. It didn't matter how perfectly you kept the law. It didn't matter if you were circumcised, as Abraham was directed. That alone would not have saved you. Only the sacrifice of Christ, his death, his resurrection, only through that can we be saved. For one, because we've been proven to be incapable of keeping the law perfectly. So that part's out the window. But we can never do enough good, we can never accomplish enough of those things to be able to save ourselves. That's what Paul was dealing with. He wasn't trying to say it is a faith that is only a belief that saves us. He's saying that it is a level of faith, a circumstance of faith in what Jesus has done, what Jesus has told us. And when we reach that level, we have reached saving faith. James writes and deals with this in James, the 2nd chapter. And part of what James is probably writing is probably to counteract some of the same things that people are trying to teach today that say what Paul said, people were trying to say then. James chapter 2, beginning with verse 18. Someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. Let me pause there for just a second. I think almost my entire life I have read this as being the statement that James goes on to make. You have faith, I have deeds that show my faith. I have come to the conclusion that's not what James is stating in this first statement. I think James is stating the two arguments that are out there. One says, I have faith, and it's all I need, only faith, only a belief. The other side says, no, I've got works. I've got this keeping of the law. I've got these things. And so James lays out this position where it's one or the other. I believe I'm saved by my faith. No, I believe I'm saved by my works. And so his response to that then is, show me your faith without deeds. I will show you my faith by my deeds. I think James is going from this argument that it's one or the other, and he's saying no. The reality is, it is faith that leads to deeds. Let's continue on here. You believe that there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe that. Shut. Okay. So he's dealing with, again, this argument. You say you've got faith. I say I believe. But that's all I've got. And the demons have that. You foolish person. Do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Well, we're looking at it, right? Do we have to have deeds? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He was called God's friend. You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. Now, what we have to understand about James's argument here, what he's presenting on this, is that the deeds James is talking about are not deeds that earn salvation. He's not saying that. He's not contradicting Paul saying we're saved by faith, not by works. He's saying, if I have that faith that saves me, it automatically has works. It produces works. I don't do them because I'm trying to earn my way. I don't do them because they're gaining me more credit. I don't do them because in and of themselves they are required as my salvation. No, I do them because it is part of my faith. They are the results of a faith that has reached the point of being biblical, righteous faith. A faith that does not respond with these actions. I wrote down it's not really faith. It may be a belief. It may be a level of faith, but it is not a level of faith that has yet reached the point of being able to save. You're still there where the demons believe and shudder. It is not a faith that has been put into motion, a faith that has motivated you to do what it takes to be a disciple of Christ. James gives us this example that lays this out in the life of Abraham. We consider Abraham to be this great hero of faith, to be one that is the one that you look to and see as the example of what it means to believe God. And yet, as James points out here, when was Abraham's faith made complete? It wasn't the moment that he said, I believe God. It wasn't when God called him to go to a foreign place. That's where his belief started. The action started when he left that place and started going where God called him. But then he gets to this point, the example that James gives, God said, okay, I've given you a son of promise. Now I need you to take that son and offer him as a sacrifice to me. Abraham said, okay, I believe. And it was credited to him as righteousness, right? That's what the text says. It was not even credited to him as righteousness when he got Isaac and he gathered up all the stuff to take with him and they started traveling to the mountain. It wasn't considered complete faith when he built the altar. His faith was considered complete. He became the friend of God. It became credited to him as righteousness. When Isaac was laying on the top of that altar, the knife was drawn back and the hand was coming forward to plunge that knife into the heart of his son. And God stopped him at the last moment. God says, I know that you believe me because you were willing to offer your son. That's when his faith was shown to be complete. Could God have known what he was going to do from the moment he left the house going to build the altar? Yeah, he could. But he said it wasn't credited to him until he offered Isaac. That is important for us, and we're going to dive into some of this more here in some upcoming weeks. I'm not sure exactly when we're going to start it, but I'm working on a series on the subject of faith. And these levels of faith and figuring out where we're at and how to grow and how to move through this process. And so when we get to start that series and we work through this, we're going to see this more in depth. Excuse me. But without the act of offering Isaac, his faith was incomplete. It wasn't righteousness. It wasn't friend of God. So bring that back to what Jesus says for us. Jesus says it may begin with this belief, with this want to be a disciple, but it's got to be a want that moves you to action. So what is the action? Jesus says, deny yourself, take up the cross, follow me. Saving faith and discipleship both center on taking the importance off of self and placing it on Jesus. It is seen in the call to repentance. It is seen the call in the realization that I can only be saved through Christ, his sacrifice. It is seen in the call to submission and to obedience. The call to carry out the purpose and the mission of Christ. And that's what Jesus is talking about with this statement. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. He says the focus has to come off of you. It has to go on to me and my purpose. It has to come bringing the spotlight onto what Jesus was trying to accomplish, which was seek and save the lost. To bring compassion to a lost and dying world. To bring the good news of what God was doing through him. To share the message of salvation. To do that in submission to God. And notice Jesus says this is not a part-time situation. He doesn't say on Sunday mornings, deny yourself, pick up a cross, follow me. He doesn't say this is a momentary thing, it's a one-time action. What's he saying? He says this is something you got to do daily. Today, the focus will not be on me. Today, the focus will be on sharing Christ with those around me. There's a lot of different ways to do that. We talked about that last week with the talents and how God calls us, the way that he calls us, the things that he's looking for us to do. There's a lot of different ways to carrying the cross, of carrying on the mission of Christ. But it is a daily thing. How am I going to do it today? How do I put the focus on Jesus today? It is a complete giving of self to God and his path of righteousness. Jesus wrapped it up there in that statement. Take up the cross and follow me. It's not walking beside an equal. Jesus will always be the older brother. Yes, we're adopted. Yes, we become children of God. Yes, he becomes our brother. But he's the older brother. And in their day, in their culture, they really understood there was a role, rights, and responsibilities that an older brother had. We kind of lose some of that today. But Jesus will always have those responsibilities. But there's another aspect of this. Not only is he our brothers, he is still, always has been, and always will be part of God. Greater than we. Our role is to follow. Not to walk beside, not to lead him, not to say, okay, God, I kind of think I got this direction figured out. I'm going to step out and take the lead and run with it for a little bit. It is always to follow. Where he leads, where he directs, where he calls, where he commands. Our role is that of submission. Follow the direction of Christ. And when we do that, that's what Jesus talks about in these last few verses of Luke chapter 9 that we looked at. Losing our life for him. Laying it down for his cause. Again, to focus off of self and all on him. It is the complete giving of ourselves to him and his direction for our lives. That's the summary, the overview. What it takes and what it means to be a disciple of Christ. There were those who were sitting there with him that day, and as he told them this, he said, you know what? I thought I wanted to be a disciple. But you just made me a disciple some things that I'm not so sure that I want. And there were those that left him that day because they didn't want to be a disciple to the level of being a disciple. There were others that were there that day that said, sounds like a tough road, but I believe in it that I want to be your disciple. And they continued forward to do the things that Christ called them to do. And they became disciples of Christ. And so the question this morning for you is, do you want to be a disciple of Christ? Do you want to follow Jesus? Or does it sound like something that's too much to ask of anybody? Daily, that takes too much time. That takes too much away from me. Losing myself in order to find Christ, I've spent all this time trying to find myself. Now you want me to lose myself? For some people, it would be too much to ask. Sadly, they'll leave without being a disciple of Christ, even though they may have a level of belief in him. Or will you be one of the ones that reach the point of saving faith? Because your faith moves you haven't put much in this lesson about what those steps are today, as Jesus laid it out for the initial process at least. And I think everybody that's here today, at least in person, has already done those steps. But that doesn't mean that we don't have some failure to do this daily. Doesn't mean that we don't have some moments where we stumble about whether we're going to be a disciple or not. Jesus is not looking for part-time disciples. He's looking for full-time. He calls us to full-time. We can help you this morning in some way to answer that call. Let us know as we stand together in a second.